Today on the Working Cows podcast, we're talking to Jeremy Sweeten and John Hayes about the profitability of amp grazing in Midwestern environments. We're going to talk about some of the particular challenges that the Midwest presents for grazing in general, as well as how amp grazing overcomes those challenges. All that and more today on episode 439 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. Very excited to be joined today by John Hayes and Jeremy Sweeten. Both of them find themselves in really the heart of the Midwest, dealing with high rainfall, snow, and a lot of different challenges that come along with those things from a grazing perspective. Also, they're dealing with competing with other people who are in really profitable corn and soybean, or ostensibly profitable corn and soybean operations, and having to compete with those cash rents and some of those things. So we're going to talk to them about the profitability of amp grazing in those Midwestern environments and how they've been able to maximize the benefits that they have found there. We're going to talk to them today about that on the Working Cows podcast right after a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. Are rising input costs keeping you up at night? At Understanding Ag, they help producers like you save money and build resilience through regenerative agriculture. Their team of experienced farmers and ranchers will show you how to reduce reliance on costly fertilizers, pesticides, and feed by working with nature, not against it. With proven regenerative practices, you can improve soil health, boost water retention, and increase your land's productivity while cutting expenses. From grazing plans to cover cropping to full system redesigns, they tailor solutions to your land and your goals. Let them help you make the transition from input-intensive, conventional, to profit-enhancing regenerative agriculture. Visit understandingag.com and take the first step toward a more profitable and sustainable future. John, Jeremy, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast. Welcome back.
My pleasure, Clay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to people. You're both east of the Mississippi. I got an email the other day. Somebody said I should talk to people east of the Mississippi more often. So here I am fulfilling that request. But it is a marked difference, right? From my own personal experience, I'm even west of the Missouri. And so there's a lot of difference there. We were just talking before we started recording, kind of where we're all at in the spring and where we find ourselves. I was noticing today the majority of the crested wheat plants in some of the places we've already grazed are headed out. So a lot of the haymaking in my neighborhood is going to get started, and a lot of the grass growing is starting to slow down. And so that's kind of where we're at here at the first part of June in 2025 in our neighborhood, just based on the weather patterns that we've had this spring. And so it's a different set of challenges that we face than what you guys face there in the Midwest. Not the least of the challenges is probably, from my perspective, the cash rent that you have to be able to compete with for grazing. And then also another thing from my perspective would be the parasite load that you guys are, and forage quality that you're dealing with. So we could probably keep stacking up the challenges, but are those legitimate concerns in you guys' experience?
Yep, sure are. Moisture being one of them. We deal with a lot more mud than you folks do out in the western part of the regions. So we have to adapt to those things.
And I was going to say our forage species are all cool seasons predominantly, maybe some summer annuals, but very, very few native warm seasons. So part of the challenge then with all that rainfall is then working through that quote unquote summer slump and how to manage for that. So that can be the real deal, especially the further south and hotter you go. So,
Right. John, is that true for you too, as far as the cool seasons, or you guys get some warm seasons there?
We're still predominantly cool seasons here as well. Not that we shouldn't have warm seasons, but they haven't been encouraged or promoted in this part of the country for many years. So yeah, predominantly cool season.
They've probably actually been penalized, right?
Yes, they have.
And so the summer slump, define that term for me, Jeremy.
So, this is going to be the time period after the reproductive growth occurs in those cool season plants. So it's flowered, set seed, and then the summer turns off hotter and drier. In John's part of the world, which is also where I grew up, Indiana, it's going to be that July, August time frame, and there's going to be a real drop in forage production, or there can be, especially in a traditional rotational grazing model. So, and then as the fall rains come in and it cools off, then the cool season grasses take back off again.
Sure.
So there's a lot of managing through that.
Yep. That's same here.
Yep.
July and August, not much happening. And then we get that second shot of rain towards, and the cool enough temperatures for those cool seasons to grow, in September. And we get that other bump, but for us, mostly that's going to end up being stockpile, for winter, that we're going to count on. And then also we count a lot on, and I'm sure you're the same, count a lot on that, fall moisture to kind of set the tone for the next spring as well. So, let's contrast then, Jeremy. You mentioned the traditional rotational grazing. John, can you define AMP grazing for me? What is it?
Yeah, the acronym simply stands for adaptive multi-paddock grazing. As the name indicates, it's not prescriptive. We're going to adapt to whatever the current situation requires. We're not sex stock grazing. We're not just simply rotating in a prescriptive manner. We're looking at what forage we have available out there, what the animal needs are, and making decisions as we go as to how to graze and manage these pieces of the land.
What are, in both of your experience, what are some of the biggest tools that we have to be adaptive? I mean, some of the things that come to mind, just to kind of tell you where I'm going, but you can go a totally different direction. Like we can adjust the stocking rate. We can sell some animals. We can bring in animals. That's one way to be adaptive. Another one is adapting as far as the size of our paddocks. Or are they in a high nutrition demand? Do they need more selectivity to go out there and find those higher nutrient dense plants that they need for this moment? Is that part of what you're talking about as far as adaptivity?
Yes, and another thing I should have said in the definition is we strive for a very short graze period followed by a long rest period. That's another key component of AMP grazing, and we're trying to, like Jeremy mentioned, the summer slump a while ago that'll be coming on here before too long. If we can stockpile forage for that, and if we have, that also allows to preserve moisture going into that dry season, where if we, I say dry season, it's not always dry, but if we're going to have dry times of the year, that's probably when it's going to be. So we can really preserve some moisture and set up the stage for things to grow nicely in the fall once things cool off and get some more moisture again.
So
go ahead.
And Clay, I'll add to this. And a lot of the consults that I do, I try to describe AMP grazing as observation-based or an observation-based chess game. You're not necessarily going to move linearly or one point at a time, but you may be all over the board with how you rotate livestock, how you set up paddock size. But it really comes back to what that intended, what your intentions are, what you want to pull out of that grazing session, whether you want to put gain on or you want to trample residue down and add more carbon to the soil. Are you running, like you said, are you running dry cows? Are you running finishers? What's the plan? And that really dictates your outcome. And then the steps of adaptive grazing are how you get there.
Sure. Yep. And, I think that the short and long in that short graze period, followed by a long rest period, those are somewhat relative terms, right?
They are. And, we talk a lot about rest period and recovery period. So recovery period is that time frame when the plant regrows and you no longer see the bite mark in the leaf, how the tip will be flattened off. And then rest period after that is the amount of time that it's not grazed, and that does not count the dormant season of winter. So, even in the Midwest, year rest periods are part of adaptive grazing, even if it's only on a small percentage of the acres. So we're going to do some of the same practices you do west of the Missouri, maybe just not as many acres at a time.
Right. And I think that, from my perspective, grazing and good grazing is more about where you're not than where you are, or at least as much about where you're not than where you are. What that area is having a chance to do while you're not there is as important or more important than what's happening in the places where you are. Would you guys agree with that?
Most certainly.
And
yes. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it also depends too, then when you come back. That's just as important as a rest period. Making that decision of when to come back for what reason. So, for example, if I want to promote more plant species coming from the native soil seed bank, I'm going to give that field a long rest period, and I may come in with finishers then and just top that so they're not down in that residue eating those younger plants, so we can propagate a more diverse pasture that way. So, that's just one example.
And how has that been going? Have you seen the diversity increase over time on your own place?
Yes. And, and I don't remember if I've mentioned this on previous podcasts or not, and I apologize if I have, but it's still important to bring out that we've been working with Michigan State University on doing pasture evaluations and different things. And, we had 4 to 7 predominant species when we started all this, really coming out of the rotational grazing method. And by allowing those extended rest periods, I think we're up to 27 different species now. And we didn't seed anything. That was free, which, on a low input side of adaptive grazing, that just makes you happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen similar things here on my end, Jeremy. Like you said, going into this 4 to 7 predominantly cool season species, and last year I was able to document over 35 different species that were not introduced into that on those same pastures. So I know a lot of people talk about having 150 plus different species. We're just not that far down the journey yet here on our place, but we're seeing 30 to 40 different species now that weren't here before, just by simply changing our management.
Right. And were some of those species like brome and some of that you had before? Is that?
Yeah, there's some brome coming in. There's forbs that we haven't seen before that are doing a nice job. Not only things for the soil, but also providing good nutrition for the livestock. And
have you seen the succession happen too, where you'll see one species this year and then next year it's something else, and yes, it's better than what was there before, right? Yeah,
definitely see a lot of successional things going on that way.
Yeah, I was just taking some pictures last night. We had a hayfield that we planted a cover crop in a couple of years ago, and last year we seeded some natives in there, and this will be the first year we haven't done anything in there, and it's not native yet. Or there at least there aren't, the natives that we planted aren't there yet. But there's other stuff growing, and I just want to take some pictures and see what's there next year and see if it's better, more desirable stuff there, and then just keep track of that and watch and see how it goes over time, and see how long it takes for that to get back to something that is better than what we had before we started with the cover crops, because we didn't make the investment to just keep rolling those covers, and I think that is maybe a faster way to do it, but just not something that we wanted to make that investment in doing that at this time, and so we're going to take a slower approach and see what good grazing and some of those things can do in the long run. So,
yeah, we started seeing some warm season natives coming into some of our pastures last year that, for one, were not introduced, and two, we haven't seen in many years. So, and that's exciting to see that transition starting to take place.
Yep. Do you have something there, Jeremy?
Yeah, you brought up an interesting point. You mentioned you were out taking pictures. And because this is so observational based, cell phones can be a curse and a blessing at the same time, or smartphones can. And what you're doing is exactly right by tracking that year after year after year, because it's hard to remember year after past year. I can't remember what I had for breakfast most days, let alone what a field looked like a year ago. But, that allows you, those cell phones, the smartphones will allow you to identify new plant species, because not every one of us are agronomist or botanist. And that's a great tool for that. But the curse of those things is we're so used to instant gratification now in quote unquote modern society that, by golly, we want it now and want it fast, and it's not changing this year, so we're doing something wrong, so we need to add an input to it. Well, Gabe and Alan will talk about the fact that this is a degraded system, and it's been degraded for decades or even more than a century in different places, and it's going to take time to fix.
Yep.
So, realize that small changes are happening all the time, and at some point when the regeneration really does start to happen, the growth will be exponential.
Yep. And before, it was a solid stand of crested wheatgrass where there was, I say solid stand, there were places where I could throw my hat down out there, my cowboy hat out there, and not touch a plant. That's how much bare ground was out there. And now, actually, there, I would say, less desirable species that are there now, but there's more of them. And the ground is very soft. It's easy to step a step-in post into now, and so, have we taken maybe a step backwards? Maybe we have, but are we going to have more cover there on the soil? And are we going to set that biology underground up for success more than we would have if we just had that crested wheat there? I'm not so sure that is true. So, I think it's kind of a matter of perspective too. And
I think you're definitely making way for better things to come by what you just described.
Right. And along with, a matter of perspective, there's other competing grazing systems out there before we talk about corn and soybeans. But there's other competing grazing systems out there. There's set stocking and rotational grazing. And I think that some people would say, well, I don't have time to move my cows, that often. And I think that maybe a lot of where that comes from is a misunderstanding of what it means to move cows in an adaptive multi-paddock grazing system. Can you describe that to me? Kind of what it looks like for you guys as far as setting up paddocks and moving cows? Is it call 4-horse trailers full of horses to come over and help you gather and push them? Go find them all and then push them on to the next paddock. Is that what that looks like?
Go ahead, John.
No, that's not at all what it looks like. I was a set stock grazer once myself, and kept the same amount of cattle on there throughout the growing season, sometimes even some pastures year round. And it got to where you had very few species of plants that could survive that type of system. And certainly this time of year, you have things mowed down there. The cattle are grazing it off about as fast as it'll grow. And then when that summer slump does come, there's nothing there for them. So, when we made the transition, one, it was hard for me to imagine moving cows daily. Matter of fact, if you'd asked me prior if I'd move cows daily, I would have told you it was crazy at one time. But now, I started out moving them once a week, saw the benefits of doing that, and realized that in order to accomplish the goals that I really wanted to accomplish, not only with animal performance, but with improving soil health and forage stands, that the daily moves, and even more than once a day, was going to get me there much quicker. So, No, it does take a little bit of time, but it's not a big deal. We have good perimeter fences around all of our pastures that we graze, and we go out there and we set up an interior fence with polywire, a single polywire and step-ins post, and it doesn't take much time at all to do that on a daily basis. And the cows are trained to that. They every time they see you show up out there, they're ready for another move, and you simply just open the poly wire up and move them on to that next paddock, and there they go to grazing again.
And Jeremy, when we contrast AMP grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, with rotational grazing, would that just be that rotational grazing is kind of that prescriptive, we're going to turn them in here and they're going to be here for this long, whether or not the forage holds out, and we're going to go to the next one, and then we'll be back here maybe same time next year, or maybe even a different time next year, but we just keep going in this same circle?
To me, it's like set stalking in motion, right? So at least you feel better because you're doing something. And that's where we, very traditionally trained in my formal education, not that it was wrong, but there's now a better way to do it. And being trained in rotational grazing, our carrying capacity of our ground actually started going backwards because we weren't allowing enough rest for those plants, even at a 35-day rotation. And really what I know now, we were overgrazing by taking too much material off. The soil was getting hot, and all those were very negative compounding cascading effects. And, it just took, I can remember we had a really ample forage year, and we had some fields we didn't touch, and we went ahead and started grazing the cows out there in that same rotational grazing method, but they were going slower because there was more material. And then we were trampling a bunch of high lignin forage to the ground. And that slowed our whole rotation system down. And that's when we started to see all the positives start to happen. So that was kind of fun. And, I would talk to folks a lot about, you might not have time to go move cattle, but can you afford to buy hay, or can you afford to pay rent or land ownership cost on less productive ground? What's that value really worth? Yeah, it's time out of your day, but don't you need to check your cattle anyway? And that's really part of becoming an observer, is wanting to spend time with them. And that move is kind of the highlight of the day at that point.
Before we move on to talking about livestock and how they can benefit even, cropland and some of those things, we're going to take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. As farmers and ranchers, we've all heard pitches from ag consultants about the next great new product that will increase our yields, pounds, or animal performance. And each of those silver bullets comes with a price tag that you pay year after year, taking more money out of your pockets and putting it into someone else's. Our friends at Understanding Ag aren't out to sell you anything, but the knowledge to grow healthier soils, plants, animals, and profits. Their goal is to help you become your own best manager, a short-term client, but a long-term friend and partner on the road to regeneration. If you're still waiting for that next year that's going to be better, maybe it's time you give Understanding Ag a call. Check them out at understandingag.com. I know you'll be glad you did. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about livestock and about, how specifically cattle are one of the most powerful tools that we have for building soil health. What are some of the things that come to mind on that front, John?
Yeah, when you manage the cattle adaptively to achieve a certain soil health outcome, there's no quicker, no better way to improve soil health and soil function. Once I fully understood that, that's what really sort of turned the light switch on and got me excited about going down this path and seeing the results and the benefits of it. So we can build fertility through our management, or we can build fertility, or we can simply go out and purchase and apply fertility. And it's a choice. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing, we can build that fertility, and maintain and not only maintain but improve the system that we're grazing on. Whereas if we're constantly either set stock or prescriptive rotationally grazing it, we're going to be relying on a lot more inputs to grow forage, and it's just not necessary if we'll look at this system here.
Yeah, certainly. What are some of the things, I mean, were you a row crop guy with cattle, or were you a cattle guy who did row crops on the side? Was there no row crops? What was your kind of life previous to this regenerative shift?
Previous to the regenerative shift, my crop ground was all in hay. I had a commercial hay business, if you will, where instead of growing cash corn, soybeans, then I was haying it and then selling that hay on the commercial market. And once I realized the benefits of the adaptive grazing and then not having to rely on these inputs to grow a forage crop, like I said, it changed the whole way I looked at things, and I was able to get off of the purchase and fertility and letting nature build that fertility for me. And then, like you said, using those cattle as that tool to do so.
And Jeremy, how often do you think, I mean, obviously every year or every whatever fits your context is best, but I mean, is there benefit to just having cows out there, not even every year, but every year or so, every few years?
And I'm going to extrapolate this out from conversation with Alan and Gabe and other consultants, but it seems like even if you can get livestock impact across that landscape every 4 or 5 years, there's a benefit there. So, we're doing some silvopasture, and we did a grazing last year, and now watching the grass come back in some of those woodlots is incredible, because it used to be that the pasture didn't always look as good as things did outside the fence. Now outside the fence looks just as good as the pasture. So, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but anytime you can get livestock impact on the ground, if done correctly, there can be negative impact as well, but it will benefit you.
And I've been saying, maybe even since the beginning of the Working Cows podcast, that there's an opportunity, especially in the Midwest, for that enterprising or entrepreneurial young person to go knock on the doors, say, hey, I don't own the cattle, but I know where I can find some, and I'll bring them, and I'll make sure they've got water, and I'll make sure they stay in, and I'll make sure they're not in the ditch, and I'll make sure that you can go to Florida and not get a phone call, and we can integrate livestock onto these crop acres too. Do you think that shift is happening, or are you seeing that happen, or is the opportunity still there and totally untapped?
I would say that a lot of the opportunity is untapped yet, because if you look at the age of the average row crop farmer in the Midwest, they're at the point in a career that they don't want to take on any more enterprise, whether it's financially or from time or just from physical age. Right. And there's no reason that the row crop guy needs to be the cowboy. And breaking that paradigm down, and like you said, finding those enterprising young individuals. I've consulted with a few folks that are those young guys, and their enthusiasm is incredible. The biggest challenge I've seen so far is getting the row crop producers to put wheat into the rotation, especially in the mid, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois type part of the world, and just put wheat back in, because they don't even want to hassle with wheat. But then that wheat provides the avenue to put cover crops in. So, John, do you have anything you want to build onto that with?
Yeah. Like you said, I think the opportunity's largely untapped. There's an infrastructure problem when it comes to integrating livestock and row crops here in the Midwest, because most of the fences have been taken down. There's not water infrastructure. So, those are challenges for somebody that wants livestock on their ground or wants to put livestock on the ground, but they're easily overcome. There's ways to build very cost-effective fence. You can get creative with water. Matter of fact, the hauling water is not as big a deal as you think it is if you just put your mind to that's what you're going to do. So I think there's a huge opportunity for livestock people and row crop people to work together and have beneficial outcomes for both sides in this part of the country.
Yeah.
You know,
Go ahead.
let me add one more thing to that, Clay. If you're an enterprising young individual, how are you going to compete with a row crop farm if land rent is $300+ per acre? So, the guys that are really going to make it running livestock are going to be the innovators that figure out ways to make this work. And there's all kinds of examples out there that guys are doing. And then also developing a relationship with the correct row crop farmer. Not all the personalities are going to line up, and the thought process of regeneration and all that. So that's the other part of that balancing act, but it is very obtainable and doable.
Yeah, and let's talk about the row crops a little bit. Being in the Midwest, Michigan actually has an I in it too. Now that I think about it, all these I states, right? I don't know if it quite fits the description, but is corn and soybeans really that profitable? I mean, is it the thing that's keeping these people from integrating livestock onto these corn and soybean acres, that they're just too profitable to really mess with more profit? Is that the problem?
That's been the case, but not so much in this economic climate. Corn and soybean, it's not a good situation right now, and just not good at all. So there's a lot of motivation now to look at reducing inputs, becoming more resilient, and how do we rely less on all these inputs, and adaptive grazing, having livestock on the land are definitely avenues to reduce those inputs and create cash flow and margin from other ways than what we're traditionally used to around here.
What are some of the things, Jeremy, stacked against them as far as the profitability of corn and soybeans?
Land rent is a huge one, because previous high commodity prices have driven land rent up, and they have not followed suit with current commodity prices. Inputs, equipment, trying to find labor, working off farm, the amount of time spent with the family, all that's stacked against being profitable with row crops. And a lot of it's just the economy of scale at this point. So
get big or get out. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm sorry?
Get big or get out. Is that what you're talking about?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And then on top of that,
think about all the
on top of that, the soil health, right? The degrading, it's not just a degraded resource. In a lot of those cases, it's a degrading resource. And so more inputs to achieve the same yield every year, right?
And less resiliency.
And another thing we're competing with, if you want to look at adaptive grazing versus row cropping, is all the safety nets and the subsidies that prop up the row crop operations. We don't have those in the grazing world. So, that's something that I guess you could call it a challenge, but maybe some of these cash rents that are going on around here aren't because of corn and soybeans being so profitable. Maybe it's all the safety nets that allow them to be able to cash flow those high rents.
Right. Certainly. And also, I mean, when you start to integrate livestock on these acres, you're able to reduce some of those inputs. Is that right? With amp grazing, especially?
Yes. Yeah. If done correctly, you mentioned it a while ago, livestock can be degrading to an environment as well, but that's where adaptive grazing really shines, is we're out here, we have specific outcomes in mind, and we will reduce inputs in the system by properly grazing the livestock the way they should be grazed on this ground. But it's not paradise all of a sudden. You can certainly create some unintended consequences for yourself if you don't follow the right program. Especially when it comes to integrating cattle into a row cropping system with, depending on the time of the year you're grazing that cover crop and when the next cash crop's going to be planted. If the soil is already collapsed and compacted and degraded, and little to no aggregation, putting cattle out there isn't going to fix that in one grazing. So, I've seen many cases where we've taken livestock or somebody's taken livestock out here and adaptively grazed the cover crop and expecting a huge outcome from that one grazing event. And it's just not going to happen that way. It's a slow progressional thing that, yes, there were positive things that will occur because of that one grazing event, but you're not necessarily going to reduce all your input or reduce a lot of inputs just from that one grazing event. So again, you have to take a bigger picture, more holistic look at things and how it all works together.
Yeah, from my understanding, it's a nonlinear process, but it takes about 4 or more years to get to that point where it starts to have that exponential increase. And so you have to, in our case, we've been, I think, about 6 years into this, but 3 of those years or more, maybe 3 or more of those years have been a fairly significant drought. And so, we're not where I wanted to be or expected to be, but I think we can still see less bare ground and some of those things improving over time.
Yeah. And whether it's a grazing system or a cropping system, our focus should always be on building soil aggregation. And that's what's going to drive improvement. If we can build soil aggregates and depth of soil aggregates, it doesn't matter what the system is, we're going to see positive results. It's the same in the row crop world as it is in the grazing world. And it's the same in the grazing world, whether it's here in the Midwest or in the more brittle environments. We need to be focusing on building that soil aggregation. That's what makes the whole system work.
Yeah, Jeremy, talk to me about the key to building soil aggregation. What are some of those principles that we're really paying attention to?
What we really like is to follow the 6 principles of soil health that we talk about so often, about keeping the soil armored, keeping a living root in it as much as possible, adding diversity to it, really basing this on the farm's context and helping them dial in to what their operation and their goals are. But, some of those 6 principles also include livestock integration. Mm-hmm. And you get a lot of pushback on that, whether it's in an orchard or row crop farm or anybody that's not livestock.
Yeah, certainly.
But you have to do as many of those as possible, as much as the time. You can't cherry pick 1 or 2 and say, well, I've got the soil armored, but I don't have a living root in it, right? So you got to do as much as possible as long as possible.
In a difficult winter environment, have you seen it possible to have a living root without cover crops 365 days of the year?
So, and we're in a perennial system. So yes, we do. If there's a little bit of corn silage ground around us and they're not putting cover crops out. So, the only thing that's coming in there is a winter annual weed or forb, depending who's listening to this, Gabe. Yeah, the perennial system is ideal in these longer, higher snowfall, long winter environments. So,
yep, certainly. And I think that in those contexts where you do have more moisture, there are advantages. You can probably shorten the time scale of that improvement some than we are going to do out here in the West. But there's also challenges, right? I mean, there's I think the increased pest load, the increased parasite load is going to be a challenge. And so the solution to that challenge a lot of times is, let's purchase something to kill these worms. Let's buy a vaccine. Let's have a supplement. Let's feed some hay, and so this strategy, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, is also a key in reducing all of those things. Can you talk to me about how it actually goes about reducing the need for these inputs?
Yeah, I think it's important to make sure that we understand what we're trying to do in all these systems is steward those 4 ecosystem processes to work as nature intends for them to. We have the energy flow, we have the water cycle, the mineral cycle, the diversity or community dynamics, whichever you want to call it. And our jobs as land managers, regardless of what we're trying to grow, is to steward those ecosystem processes. Jeremy talked about the 6 principles a minute ago and how important they are to building aggregation. And if we can steward those processes, then nature's designed to cycle our nutrients for us. There's been many soil tests taken across many acres in this country that show we don't have a deficiency in nutrients in the soil. They're not in a plant available form a lot of times. So if we will get these ecosystem processes functioning as they should, then the nutrients are going to be there for the crop that's growing. So that's really our goal. And adaptive grazing is just a very powerful tool. It's one of those tools, very powerful tool to help us to that end. And
Yep.
we can't accomplish those same things by set stock grazing or just simple prescriptive rotational grazing. So that's where the adaptive part of it comes in and sets the stage for us to be able to steward those ecosystem processes in a positive way.
Yeah, what are some of the things that you've seen actually be the most profitable when we're talking about the profitability of AMP grazing in the Midwest? What are some of the classes of livestock that you have seen work the best from a profitability standpoint?
A lot of guys, I just consulted on a farm last week. The gentleman has limited acres, and the first thing he did was buy cows. And the challenge with cow-calf pairs is the amount of acres that they take. And we had the conversation about, could he be more profitable with sheep? Could he be more profitable with poultry? Could he be more profitable with stockers? And so it really comes back to knowing your cost of production and mapping those out, or at least getting good estimates of what you're going to do with any of those enterprises and looking at those. But having, back to those 6 principles, having that animal diversity on your farm is just as important as the forage or the crop diversity. So if you can integrate multiple species of livestock, you're going to jump forward faster. So I guess to answer your question directly, Clay, I believe those fully integrated systems are more important than just having one species of livestock. They're more important for profitability.
Certainly.
Yeah. And to add to that, if I may, Jeremy mentioned the cow calf, that's the least profitable of the cattle enterprises. And so not that you can't make money at that in this environment, because you can, but it's not necessarily going to be your most profitable environment. So if you have good forage quality, understand how to properly finish cattle, grass finishing is something that's very doable here in the Midwest. And we can grow a lot of good forage to finish on here if we'll take the time to understand how all that works. And there was a podcast recently that covered a lot of the keys on grass finishing, so we won't go into that, but grass finishing can be highly profitable, and stockers, and like Jeremy said, bringing in other species of livestock as well. So, but don't start with the cow calf. Is probably if you're looking for the most profitable operation.
It's the least profitable of the cattle, and from my understanding, many times I've heard people say that the cattle are the least profitable of the livestock species in a lot of ways. So cow-calf is the bottom of the bottom in a lot of ways, and oftentimes the most attractive to everybody for, I think probably cultural or idyllic reasons more than actual profitability, right?
Yeah. And then one thing else I'll say about the profitability is there's so much of the profits determined on how we market things. We could get into the whole discussion about marketing. Probably won't have the time for that today, but whether we're going to sell our product as a commodity or whether we're going to sell it to direct to consumer, we still have marketing options. So, if we're not interested in direct to consumer marketing, spend the time to really get good and learn sell by marketing. And even if you are going to direct to consumer market, you still really ought to understand and be good at sell by marketing. So, there's so much more money to be made when you understand those principles than just taking what you have to the sale barn and collecting the check at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, Clay, several consults this spring have really brought out to the point that, I told one guy, I said, the only thing you should be married to on this farm is your wife. But he was also married to his cows. Because even though it made more economic sense and they were struggling financially, it made more economic sense for them to sell the cows, sell those overvalued items, and custom raise stockers. He didn't want to do it because there was an emotional connection to that. And that's part of the context. I'm not saying he was right or wrong, but the look on his face when I presented that idea of selling those cows was just aghast. He didn't know what to do or even to say about it, but the longer he thought about it, the more it did make sense. So don't get caught in that rut. It's just like some guys are married to equipment, right? Yeah, I love equipment too in certain things, but don't get hung up on having to own anything if you're truly concerned about profit and having an impact on your farm.
Yeah. You guys have both kind of alluded to or mentioned stacking enterprises, multi-species grazing. When you start to think about doing things like meat chickens or eggs or pigs or goats, are you kind of by default going to be into a direct-to-consumer marketing business? Are you going to have to go out and develop your own market and start selling things that way? Or are there opportunities still, even through co-ops or relationships with local grocers to get some of that stuff marketed?
It's certainly going to put you further down the direct marketing path. Do you have to market all those things directly to the consumer yourself? No. But yes, you're going to need to know who your market is or who your customer is, whether you're going to, like I said, whether you're going to deliver it to the end consumer or not. So there's plenty of partnerships and collaborations out here available if a person thinks out of the side of the box, gets creative on where to go with those different products.
Is it possible to do anything like that though, like selling meat chickens or eggs through a local grocer? Have you heard of that being an opportunity, or are there too many regulations in the way of that happening?
That's very doable. There's a lot of producers are what I'd call selling to wholesale accounts like that. Uh,
Yeah.
There's going to be you're probably going to need some volume. You're going to need some certainly consistency in your product. There's certain criteria that needs to be met on the processing side. USDA inspected processing is going to be a must, I'm sure. So, there's considerations, but yes, you do have those opportunities.
And there's advantages too, right? You don't have to go sit every Saturday at the farmer's market, but there's also probably less profit, less revenue coming directly to you in that kind of a scenario, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Clay, one thing to think about too is a lot of those stacked enterprises can involve family members, young kids, things like that, because you don't have to worry about a 7-year-old getting flattened by a bull if they're out taking care of the chickens, or at least you better not worry about that. The cattle enterprise isn't always geared directly towards family friendliness, but if you want to incorporate your children into an ag business, broilers or laying hens or geese all these other small animals are a great way to include them, and they don't have to be a huge part of your business, but they still can be part of it.
And a lot of times, can be one of those things where we test the market. Hey, this is something that the market in our neighborhood really wants, and let's expand it. Let's do more of the things that they want and less of the things that they're telling us by the way they vote with their dollar that they don't want as much.
Mm-hmm. So, and think about it this way also. What happens when the beef market crashes? Because we're at the high of the cycle, right? So what other enterprises, we talk about building resiliency in our soils, build resiliency in your business as well. what are you going to fall back on to help offset that lower income when the beef prices are down?
Yep. And as we're talking about adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and its profitability in the Midwest in this episode, when we start to talk about multi-species grazing and stacking enterprises, what are some of the things that you would caution people to be aware of or really pay attention to?
Your stocking rate versus carrying capacity would be number one.
Talk to me about what you need to be watching out for in that regard.
Well, whether we have multi-species or only one species, but if we have more livestock on our land than what we have forage available for it, then it's not going to work long term. We're going to be caught back in that rat race of buying feed all the time. So it's real easy to think, well, okay, I've got things going with cattle and I'm grazing cattle, and now let's add something else, and I'll put some chickens out there or something. But you have to make sure that you factor in, the chickens are going to utilize that forage while they're there in a very different way than the cattle do, but they're still going to utilize it. So you have to allow for that in the whole scheme of things. At all the different enterprises, you need to factor in the forage that they're going to utilize. I want to say consume, but utilize is a better word than consume, I believe. So we want to make sure we're not getting in a situation where we're pushing things too hard. And that's one thing that I think we've certainly done here in the Midwest, is tried to push things harder than nature is capable of. So we need to slow down and pay attention to what the land is really capable of handling, and stock it for that. Don't try to get too much out of it all at one time.
One thing I hear over and over again talking to the team at Understanding Ag is that 90 to 95%, or maybe more than that, of the farms and ranches they consult on are overstocked with livestock. Is that line up with your experience?
Yes.
See it everywhere we go.
Yes. Well, Clay, a lot of the Midwest is fully capable of grazing year round, whether it's, 8 out of 10 years or 4 out of 5, or, however you want to phrase that. And a lot of folks will go, no, you can't do that. We need to feed hay. We need to do whatever. But that's usually a key indicator that they're overstocked, regardless of what animal enterprise there is. But another yardstick I like to look at when I go onto a farm or a ranch is how much residue do they have at the point they're grazing? Is there residue in that green grass that's growing or not? And if there's no residue there, that's usually a pretty good indicator that they've came around too fast on their rotations, the rest periods are not long enough, and ultimately they're overstocked.
And you can see, I've heard you can see that residue go backwards over time, right? Even if you had it there to start, if you are coming back too soon and not having enough recovery and rest, that residue can go backwards as well. So something to keep an eye on. What do you think what are some good goals or some things that people the targets they should be shooting at as far as thinking about all these things, the profitability of AMP grazing in the Midwest, the integrating multiple species and some of those things? What are some of the things that kind of can be those guiding principles and goals that people can look towards to see, are we being successful?
Well, I think you can look at that from two different perspectives, and they certainly go hand in hand, but you can look at the soil health or the soil function side of it. But as we've talked here, you also need to be measuring the profitability side of it. So we need to be looking at those together, and we need to know our cost of production, as Jeremy said. We need to keep good records on that. We need to manage or keep good records, when it comes to grazing. How many animal unit days are we getting per acre per year? And is that improving or declining over time? So, we need to be and that certainly has a financial impact, And then we also need to be looking at all these criteria that speak to our soil health or our soil function. Are we able to use less or no inputs? Are we able, and like I said a minute ago, are we able to grow more forage and graze more forage off of this acre of ground or this parcel of ground by managing it one way versus another way? So it it comes down to a lot of need to be keeping good records. We need to be observing what we're doing. Jeremy talked a little bit ago about the power of observation. So we we need to manage both of those things side by side and make sure that we're in good shape on both areas.
And don't just take it for what it is. When you get that proposal from the chemical company or the seed company, it says this year this is going to be what it costs to have your fertility program bought in and applied. Maybe that can be the signal. Okay, this year it's going to be this much, and here's what we're thinking corn or soybeans is going to be worth. And maybe we're just going to say, nope, this isn't the direction we're going this year. We're going to do something else, and understanding that cost of production at that level and not just saying, well, I guess we're going to have to tighten the belt, rather saying, well, maybe this is an opportunity to make a change and go a different direction.
Yeah. And what inputs can we reduce or eliminate? And we've talked a lot about fertility, but thinking with adaptive multi-paddock grazing, why do we need to go out and clip pastures? If we graze a certain way, the cattle can trample that pasture for us and do not the same job, but a better job of doing something with that forage than what if we're going out there and clipping it, and we don't have the time and the overhead cost and the equipment and the labor of clipping a pasture.
So something that comes to mind for me, Clay, is really focusing on net profit and forgetting the yield metric, because in row crop country, everything's measured by bushels per acre, right? Or, well, how many cows do you have? Those are all bragging rights. Those aren't. If people advertise what their net profit was, most of us wouldn't do that, period, even if that was the right thing to do, because some of them are negative. Another, you mentioned targets. Another thing I really like to measure by is meaningful work. What gets you out of bed in the morning to want to go to work and that a paycheck doesn't necessarily accomplish? I think most cattle folks, especially, meaningful work that's their whole life. And so, that's a great yardstick to measure against and accomplishing those goals that you've set for your farm, for your ranch, for your life and your family. The danger is letting this consume you, and that you're no longer spending quality time with your family. You're just working because you have stacked enterprises going, and that's not good either. So you need to find a balance between your life and your happiness and what your meaningful work is. And, back to those smartphones that we talked about earlier in the podcast, one of the most important yardsticks to measure against is putting a shovel in the ground every year and looking at those areas and seeing what that soil truly looks like, because it's not going to lie to you. And, using that smartphone to go back and track all that. So really watching your progress that way, if your goal at all is soil health.
Certainly. So talk to me, just as we kind of point towards wrapping up here, about kind of the timeline and how in the Midwest, how long you see it taking to make this transition and say, we're going to be competitive or more profitable than corn and soybeans, or we're going to be able to compete with these land rent prices. How long does that take before, a given piece of land is able to produce on that level?
I think there's very different directions we could go depending on where we're starting from. Are we starting with an established perennial pasture, or are we starting with row crop land? Because
row crop land. Let's talk talk about that. If somebody's wanting to make a transition and say, what is it realistically? What am I looking at here as far as the process of getting to a place where we can go from this row crop land to a profitable enterprise that's based on grazing?
We have to get that soil functioning properly first and foremost. We can't just go in there and plant another crop and put more fertilizer on it and put livestock on it instead of growing that cash crop. We really have to be intentional about improving soil function. And as there's ways we could talk about doing that, but it's going to involve cover cropping. Maybe you don't switch from a row cropping system over 100% to a grazing system initially. Maybe you do some cover cropping and grazing. Jeremy mentioned wheat followed by a summer annual. That's a great place to start with building soil health, whether you're going to continue row cropping or whether you want to transition into a grazing enterprise. But we have to prepare that soil that's been row crop. Some of us call it biological priming, where if it's been in corn and soybeans for years or decades, it's not ready to go into a perennial system right away. So we're going to have to take that step by step, and we're going to have to get good at running the calculator or running an Excel spreadsheet to make sure that we know what our costs are and what our profitability is going to be. Not only projecting that, but actually measuring it as we're going through, because it's easy to sit down and project that we're going to do something, but we better be monitoring to make sure that we're actually achieving it, and that way we don't wake up at the end of the year and decide or realize that, oh wow, I really missed the mark here, and things don't look the way I expected them to. So a lot of planning, a lot of trying to just I lost that. So
That's all good. Jeremy, anything to add there?
Yeah, the attorney answer is it depends, right? But going from a wheat crop to a diverse summer annual polyculture, you can see soil aggregation start to build yet that season. So then, trying to take those steps and build off of it. I really like having test plots or test strips on the farm, or even field beside field comparison, so you can really compare. And it still comes back to what those goals are on what you consider regeneration, but just pulling out a no-till drill instead of a disc does not make you regenerative. And I'm going to step on some toes by saying that, but I guess I'm to the point I don't care. It takes looking at this from a whole system point of view, because you're really restoring an ecosystem. You're not just restoring a field or a farm or just to get that regenerative name thrown at it. So I guess, look at it from an ecosystem point of view and put a shovel in the ground. I've seen a lot of farms make significant progress in 4 or 5 years by switching up how they think about things and change their practices. So.
Yep. No, at the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition a couple of years ago, I was the MC for their conference, and over and over and over again, every speaker seemed to say, no-till is not enough. No-till is not enough. No-till is not enough. And kind of they were following it up. You need to integrate livestock. That was the main thing. But also multiple turns per year of different crops being planted in that rotation of no-till is going to be another big key. And I mean, obviously it's 6 principles stuff, right? It's diversity, it's livestock integration, it's reducing disturbance, chemical and mechanical. It's all those things, living roots and cover and all those things. So I mean, it's just the 6 principles again for the win, but it is that we have to remember that we can't just become laser focused on one thing. We've got to take a holistic approach and an adaptive approach. And I think we've talked about a lot of the ways to see that become a profitable enterprise. So John and Jeremy, anything else that needs to be said on this topic before I let you go?
Yeah, a couple more things I wanted to add in was one is if you're going to try to transition from a row cropping to a grazing system, there's a lot of things to know, a lot of things to take into consideration. We can't cover all that in an hour. We can't cover it all in a day, but that's what we're here at Understanding Ag to do, to help people. We do this every day ourselves on our own operations and help other people do it. So if somebody's wanting to try to go down that path, reach out to us. We're happy to help you. That's what we're in the business of doing. We don't have anything to sell you other than our advice. So there's my little shameless plug. But let's talk for a second about we talked about the row crop going to grazing, but let's talk about the advantages of set stock or more conventional rotational grazing versus adaptive grazing. We can grow so much more forage on that same piece of ground adaptively grazing it than we can conventionally set stock or rotationally grazing it. So, and there's a lot of pasture here in the Midwest. It's not all corn and soybeans, there's a lot of corn and soybeans, but there's a lot of pasture in the Midwest. And every day I drive by pasture that I think if they could adaptively graze that, they would be great. They would be growing so much more forage per year. And when I look at the time and the inputs that they spend on the set stock or the simple rotational grazing, we can eliminate virtually all those inputs and replace it with a little bit of polywire and step stake and going out there and moving your cattle every day and being intentional about that. And it's not hard to improve your bottom line on grazing. Frankly, that's the low hanging fruit in this whole system. If we're looking for low hanging fruit, is if we're not currently managing our grazing land this way, there's a whole lot to be gained by changing and managing it this way.
John, I appreciate what you said. I'm going to end with a bit of humor. You fellows well know that we all marry up, right? And, back to that quality of life thing, my wife and I went out to eat Saturday evening and we drove past some set stock pastures. And my wife pipes up and she said, I finally found an advantage to set stocking rates. And she said, you sure can see the calves easy to tag them because they're not in much grass because it's all overgrazed. So, I guess I'll end with that.
Yep. And on the other side of that, I was just talking to a guy the other day at a branding, and he said, I've seen that God designed a good system because we've had, he said, my calves born in May can stand rain, they can stand cold, they can stand wind. They don't really do well at handling all three at once. But as we're grazing our summer pastures and calving in them, and at the same time, there's sagebrush out there, there's little blue stem out there, there's buckbrush out there, and that makes a great calving barn for these young calves. And so that was a good insight on the other side of the set stock advantage. So,
yep.
John, Jeremy, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Clay.
Appreciate it, Clay.
Very good stuff there, as always, with the team from Understanding Ag. Really appreciate John and Jeremy and their perspective and just the breadth of perspective that they have from consulting on so many acres over the years. And looking forward to next week on the Working Cows podcast. We'll be talking to Grant Vassberg from Boss Sires about the work that he is doing globally, really, to provide a clearinghouse for functional cattle genetics. So we look forward to sharing that with you, coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.